began to tell you on Wednesday about how the compressor works, or the purpose of a compressor, and we're going to do that to the bass track. But the first thing I'm going to do is edit the bass track. We've got it's still just a little bit out of sync, a little bit out of time, so I'm going to show you how to do that. You can see that our downbeat of measure 2 is here, but the bass doesn't come in until here. So I need to shift that just a little bit. So what I'm going to do is select both of these tracks, trim this back a bit, and then go on into zoom, and I'm going to move this first transient of the bass over to the downbeat. And then I'll go back to the beginning of the track and pull the trimming back to the top. There we go. Okay, so now the bass should be playing in time.
2, 3, 4.
Okay, that sounds a lot better. All right, so for what the compressor does, I had explained that a compressor is sort of like listening to a TV program that's sort of quiet and intimate, and the commercial comes on and it's this guy screaming, act now and order this stuff that we're trying to sell you. And so it's really obnoxious that it jumps out like that. And so what do? You grab for the remote, you turn it down because it's way too loud, but then your show comes back on, then your show is too soft. And so you have to turn the show back up. So the controls on the compressor do all of those movements for you automatically. There's a thing that's on the compressor, to continue with our analogy, there's a thing on the compressor that sets how loud does the commercial have to be before you reach for your remote. And then what's the lag time once the commercial has reached that volume, which we call the threshold. It has reached your threshold of annoyance and you're ready to turn it down to get it to where it doesn't annoy you anymore. How long does it take you to grab the remote and begin to press the button to turn it down? And then how quickly do you turn it down after you start turning it down? And then after your program returns to its normal volume level, once it goes back down below your threshold to where you can't hear it, how long does it take you to grab the remote and then turn the program back up? So think of those as the three main controls that we use in a compressor. So we're going to drop a compressor. It's over here under Audio Effects. You'll see compressor listed here. If you open up the box, you can see that there's a bunch of compressor presets loaded in here that, let me open that up for you, that are sort of suggested compressor settings for different things. But what we're going to do is just use the generic compressor with no settings. We're going to come up with our own settings. So clicking and dragging the compressor onto, let's do the bass DI track first. So I'm going to play back, and so right now what I've done is inserted this effect on the bass. So when I begin to play, you're going to see the bass coming into this first meter, and at first there probably won't be anything happening on the second meter, and then you'll see the output on the next meter. So it's incoming signal, what the compressor is doing to the signal, and then what the output result is. So let's turn it on and watch.
2, 3, 4.
So right now we haven't done anything that would cause any change, so they're the same. Okay, I'm going to solo this so that we're just listening to the bass, but I'll have to solo it with my voice as well. Okay. All right. So this is the threshold control, this little arrow. This is the level of annoyance at which the compressor begins to work, the level of annoyance at which you begin to grab your remote and turn down the channel that's bothering you. So you watch, the lower I pull this, the more we're going to see something happen here, and then I'll explain what that is next. The GR in a compressor stands for gain reduction. That is how much turning down is happening. So it's answering so the lower your threshold is for your threshold of annoyance for that commercial, the more you're going to turn down the or really the sooner is what it is. It doesn't have to reach as high of a volume in order to start annoying you. So if you think about it as if the commercial gets this much louder, I'm going to start squashing it. I'm going to start turning it down. If your threshold is high, then it has to be pretty loud before it begins to cause you to turn it down. So I'm going to set this with some pretty extreme settings just so you can see what the effect is. Compressor is actually kind of a subtle effect. We don't necessarily want to hear it working all the time. But let's listen to what's going on as I increase the gain reduction. This is a button called Makeup, and it's what it is Makeup Gain. The amount of reduction that we're getting here, it's turning the output back up by the same amount that it's being reduced by. And you might think that that would be a little useless. Why are you turning it down just to turn it back up again? But what we're really doing is we're reducing these peaks. We're reducing the loud places, and we're squashing them down to softer. But the softest places are not being affected. So once we squash down the loud places, and they're about the same volume as the soft places, the overall track needs to be turned back up. If I turn off the makeup gain, you can see how quiet it actually gets. So you can see that without makeup gain, you can squash it to the point where you can't even hear it anymore. So now we'll talk about these controls over here on the left. The attack control is how quickly do you grab the remote and start turning the program down. Because what ends up happening is, first the signal gets above your threshold of annoyance, and so it's really loud. And then there's a delay time by the time you grab the remote and turn it down, which means some of that loudness has already snuck through. So the longer your attack time is, think of that as taking a longer time to grab the remote. So what that means is that the transients, the tips of these peaks, are going to sneak through, and the rest of the sound will be squashed. So if we put a really fast attack time, everything will be squashed. Nothing will get through. But watch as I turn the attack time up, the punchy parts of the bass, the tip of the sound, the initial transient, the first part of each note is going to punch through pretty loudly, but the rest of the sound will be suppressed. So you can really start to hear that pick attack coming through as I push the attack time up. But this is going to get even more extreme when I dial in the next control. Ratio has to do with for every decibel above your threshold, how many decibels do you want me to squash the sound by? So right now it's just 2 to 1. So for every decibel that the sound goes over our threshold, it's squashing it by 2 decibels. No, I'm sorry, for every 2 decibels it goes over, it's squashing it by 1. So the further up I turn this, 2 to 1 is half. So if the signal goes 10 decibels over the threshold, it gets squashed down to 5. If it goes 4 decibels over, it gets squashed down to 2. If I put it up on a really high ratio, like infinite, it basically works like a brick wall. Nothing gets through. If I set it to 10 to 1, then for every decibel that goes over the threshold, the compressor squashes it down to 1 decibel. So the higher settings are more extreme compression. So I'm going to dial up a higher setting, and then I'm going to play with the attack control again, and you should be able to hear an even more extreme version of our compression setting. let's see what's happening. The output of the compressor is so hot that it's causing clipping over here on our master output. So I'm going to turn the output of this track down some, so it's not clipping anymore. Okay, then this setting down here is when the volume level returns back down below the threshold, how quickly do you grab the remote to turn the sound back up? So that's the release control. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a compressor setting that balances out the level of this bass track. You can see there's like some really loud stuff here, and then there's some pretty quiet stuff here. So I'm going to run the compressor, and then I'm going to render this track just so you can see what it does to the waveform, and then we'll listen to it. So let's compare the volume of this quiet place. Turn the compressor off for a moment. And compare it to this loud place. Quiet. And loud. Turn the compressor on. Here's the quiet place. Compressor off. Compressor on. So you can see how it makes that spot jump out more, because when you turn down the loudest things in the track and the makeup gain is turning the overall track up, everything that was below the threshold gets turned up. So these quiet little sensitive things begin to jump out. So here's the loud part with the compressor. Without. So we're really hearing more of the punch of the bass by doing this. All right, so I'm going to run the compressor, and what I'm going to do is, this is a technique we haven't really discussed, but if you right-click on the track, let me duplicate this, because I'm going to do it to this track, but I want to save a copy that hasn't been affected. So you right-click on it, freeze track. Okay, so what that does is it applies all of the effects to the track and freezes it, so you can't make any changes here, but it has already created a temporary audio file that is the affected version. And when I play this back, you're going to hear it with the compressor effect, but you can't make any changes because it has already rendered a temporary file. All right, and if we flatten this, we'll see the change in the waveform itself. Now if you look, compare, these used to look identical because this was a copy of this. Now you can see that this soft part is much louder. Let's zoom in. And that these places, which were so big compared to the soft places in between, are now much closer in volume to each other. See this peak here, measure the distance sort of with your eyeballs here versus the distance here. That's volume. Now look at the distance here versus the distance here. They're much closer to each other. And also, this was pretty flat. There wasn't a big sharp peak of a transient, which is the punchy part of the sound. But now, when we zoom out, you can see that there's a bigger peak here, and that has to do with the attack setting on the compressor. See how that's relatively flat? And here you've got these sharp peaks. That's the punchy part of the sound. Same thing here. This is relatively flat, this part of the waveform, but this has this big peak. So that's where our punchiness is coming from. This is the amount of time it's taking for the compressor to start turning down the sound, and it lets this first part of the sound sneak out, and that's how we use the compressor to make things punchier. So let's listen, let's A and B these. The other thing is, if you look at the tail of the sound, it takes a lot longer for the bass to die out on the compressed version, because as the bass is getting softer as it's dying out, it's going lower and lower and lower under the threshold, so the compressor is allowing more and more and more of it to come through. So it is extending the tail, making the sustain of the bass seem a lot longer. This is the same reason why compressor pedals for guitar are often called compressor sustainers, because they are compressing the first part, the louder part of the sound, and then letting the tail of the sound become louder as it comes out. So let's listen. This is the unaffected one. Let's just listen closely here at the end. Okay, so that's how you use a compressor on the bass. There's other ways to use a compressor on the drums. There's other ways to do some electronic music techniques with the bass. So try playing around with the settings on your compressor and see if you can get the bass track to sit nicely in the mix.